Hi everyone, this week's presentation is on the anti-war movement and the cultural revolution of the 1960s. So when we refer to the cultural or social revolution of the 1960s, what exactly is it that we're referring to? We're referring to things like aspects of civil rights, both minority rights, women's rights, also sexual rights. We're talking about a movement that is to a large degree catapulted with respect to gender and sexuality because of the advent of things like the birth control pill, which inspires the development of what some scholars have called the sexual revolution. Though other scholars like Beth Bailey have suggested that the sexual revolution really wasn't a revolution at all, but was rather more of an evolution. And the reason for that is that she points out that, as was demonstrated in things like the so-called Kinsey Report of the late 50s, that Americans in the 50s were very much engaged in much of the types of sexual behavior that you would see in the 60s. But during the 50s, you had a much greater divide between the public and private world. And so in the 50s, the kind of people's sexuality was more repressed with respect to the public realm. In the 60s, of course, that line is sort of broken through, and many people in the 60s would have perceived this as a sexual revolution because of that. But scholars like Beth Bailey say that it was really more of an evolution, that the advent of notions like free love, the idea that Americans started engaging in, I suppose, for lack of a better way of saying it, less traditional manners of sexuality. It would have seemed like a revolution to the people experiencing it, but in reality it was an evolution from things that people were already doing and engaging in the decades prior. It's an era of drug experimentation, an era in which, some Americans in places like San Francisco and in places like Oregon and California began to see drug experimentation as a way of unlocking new perceptions to the world. And in many cases, some like Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, for example, or Timothy Leary, who was the former professor who famously inspired students to turn on, tune in, and drop out, a reference to using LSD to kind of open one's perceptions. And so for many like the Merry Pranksters or Timothy Leary, they believe that LSD, a drug originally developed by the CIA, and actually Ken Kesey's first experiments with the drug were actually effectively subsidized by the CIA, though he didn't know that. But they believed it was a way that could remake people's perceptions on society and on citizenship and on the nature of American democracy. There's a huge issue of poverty in the 1960s that is inspiring this cultural and social revolution. We see the emergence of the environmentalist movement because of issues associated with suburban sprawl, automobiles with unfiltered, non-catalyzed exhaust, creating issues like photochemical smog, particularly in places like Southern California, which of course becomes notorious for the emergence of the issue of photochemical smog, and led to many of the original initiatives to promote clean air. The Clean Air Act, of course, which comes on the heels of the 1960s. And of course also the advent of regulations like catalytic converters and things like this on cars. The issue of chemical pollution was a huge issue as well. We will see the emergence of the issue with the so-called Love Canal in the Buffalo, New York area, in which a chemical company that had formerly been operating in the area had literally just dumped toxic waste, unprotected, uncontained, in an open canals that residential suburban communities were ultimately built around. So the modern environmental movement, it's not the first case of environmentalism. I mean, you have to go back to Teddy Roosevelt and, folks like the Sierra Club to to find the origin of environmentalism in the United States. But in the modern sense, the modern environmental movement is spurned in the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. There's also another push for consumer protection, particularly advanced by folks like Ralph Nader, who famously wrote his work Unsafe at Any Speed, which criticized the safety standards of the Chevrolet Corvair, which had a tendency to turn over. It was top heavy, and so it posed a safety issue. Of course, Rachel Carlson's The Silent Spring, also, which examined the damage caused by DDT, particularly to bird populations. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s is a reaction to the post-World War II generation. It's a reaction to a reality of a society that was moored around more conservative, traditional ideas of society, the nuclear family, a male-dominated society. It's spurred by the widespread advent of residential segregation, workplace discrimination against minorities as well as women. It's also spurred by technology, the advent of the automobile, cheap gasoline, and so forth fuels the cultural revolutions of the 60s as well. Much of the cultural revolution of the 60s was a product of affluence, and within these movements there is a sort of contradiction in many cases, which we'll talk about in a little bit, in which in some cases the affluence of society that individuals were criticizing was actually also the thing that kind of propelled the cultural revolution of the 60s. The 1960s births a new way of thinking for many Americans, about family, about gender, and race. It should be noted, of course, that there's a huge segment of American society that would not be as much wrapped up at this time in the Cultural Revolution. There's many aspects of society that we'll talk about next week that were sort of really kind of revolted by certain aspects of the cultural and the social revolutions of the 60s. But for many Americans, this was about transforming America, about rethinking American citizenship, about rethinking American democracy, about equality and justice, and about rethinking realities of sexuality, of family, of gender, and of race. The Vietnam War was a huge factor to the Cultural Revolution because the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, provided a sort of broad umbrella for many, many, many strains of the Cultural Revolution. It was underneath the umbrella of Vietnam, we will see great civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, who famously comes out against the war in 1967. Stokely Carmichael, who framed his notions of black power and so forth against the seeming injustice of African Americans being asked to go fight in a war allegedly for freedom when freedom wasn't even possessed at home in the United States. Women's movements, individuals within the women's movement, like Jane Fonda, for example, became not only feminist advocates, but huge and significant players in the anti-war movement as well. So the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War was a really broad umbrella under which many, many, many different strains of the cultural and social revolution occurred. The primary goal of many anti-war protesters during the period of the Vietnam War movement was a more democratic society. And I think that many Americans possess some perceptions about the anti-war movement that are in fact not the case. And so what are some of the myths of the anti-war protester? I think some of the myths are kind of conveyed in this image you see here, that they're just a bunch of college kids who don't really know any better, or that they're often violent, or that they're un-American, or that they're just having a good time. Of course, there are anti-war protesters and people within the Cultural Revolution of this period that were there just having a good time. But the leaders, the people who organized the marches, the people that organized the various aspects of the anti-war movement and of various aspects of the Cultural Revolution are actually very consciously engaging American democratic society, challenging what they see as an unjust and not truly a democratic society, and hoping to encourage a recreation of that society. The truth about the anti-war protester is that anti-war protests were almost always peaceful during the 1960s. There were some violent cases, of course, and of course we have examples like the Weathermen. We had examples of individuals making bombs to bomb buildings. They sought to avoid casualties. They in some cases bombed, for example, unoccupied government buildings. So you do see that, but generally speaking, that was an extreme minority of the anti-war movement. In reality, it is almost always peaceful in nature. It's very diverse in terms of its makeup as well. You had figures that were involved in the feminist movement, involved in the civil rights movement, even Vietnam veterans, like former Secretary of State John Kerry, for example, who was a leader of the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So it's a very diverse grouping of people. And some of the voices for the anti-war movement were people that came also from established leadership positions. Higher education was a big reason for the emergence of the anti-war movement, as well as the emergence of what you might call the advent of the youth movement in the 60s. The counterculture and the rock and roll generation, if you will, was to a large degree spurred by an explosion in higher education. College enrollment from 1950 to 1960 more than doubled. More people are staying in high school longer and then going to college. So young people are growing up together. I mean, of course, but they're staying together in school longer. And, college education encourages, especially in the liberal arts area, and there's many, many great liberal arts colleges that are established during this time. This type of education, education like history, it encourages an individual to challenge the sort of preconceived notions that organize their society. And so we have more kids going to school longer and engaging in education, like liberal arts education. Not obviously exclusively that, but that's a huge factor in creating a cohesive and generational movement, youth identity. And this is very important to the advent of the anti-war movement. Interestingly, increasing attendance in college was to a large degree because of unprecedented federal and state government support. A level of support that today is not even really close. State and federal funding for higher education has comparably, in a relative sense, gone down significantly. But during the Cold War, the government really felt that we had to keep up with the Soviets. We had to maintain a technological advantage to fight the Cold War. And so as a result of this, you saw a lot of investment into science and technology, into college education, to keep the United States at the forefront when it came to important fields that could give it an advantage in waging the Cold War. It was also perceived as essential to economic growth. And so there's a new sort of investment in higher education. Many liberal Democrats in the 1960s believed in making higher education available to as many as is possible, and the idea that higher education was a birthright and not something that was entitled to the rich, not something that a person should have to, an opportunity that should only come to those who are born into wealth. So there's many folks that even thought that higher education was a key to unlocking the true promise of American democracy, and that it should be expanded to as many people as is possible. When we think about the anti-war movement, who are we talking about? If you look at this picture here, this picture really tells you what the anti-war movement, who made up the anti-war movement. And again, it flies in the face of myths and stereotypes about the anti-war movement that are often possessed today that are just simply not accurate. The myths and stereotype that it was just a bunch of, dirty hippies and young college kids out there causing trouble and having a good time. The reality is, as you look at this, the anti-war movement is not homogenous, and it's not that well organized. There's a myriad of different groups. And so it's made up of a bunch of different people. Students were very significant, particularly the Students for a Democratic Society, which was a student group that really emerged out of the Berkeley free speech movement of 1964, who were, I suppose to a large degree, you would probably say that their ideology would have been more along the lines of reform socialist or social democratic maybe, but they wanted to reform society, hence the name. And they became integrally involved in the anti-war movement as hoping that it would be a vehicle to achieve that. Professors were huge players in the anti-war movement, particularly when we talk about things like the teach-ins. The first teach-ins held at the University of Michigan State in 1965. This was the beginning of the anti-war movement, the so-called teach-ins. Mothers, there's a Mothers Against the War movement. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who famously in 1967 comes out against the Vietnam War, to the ire of Lyndon Johnson, who shortly thereafter authorized the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to begin COINTELPRO, keeping tabs on illegal wiretappings and these types of things on civil rights leaders and anti-war leaders, particularly Martin Luther King, who J. Edgar Hoover regarded as sort of like enemy number one, a communist in his view, which of course was rather a ludicrous claim, actually. Women's movement leaders, like I said, Jane Fonda, Joan Baez, the famous folk artist from the period, famous for songs like "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" Veterans, the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. John Kerry, Secretary of State, or last Secretary of State. Secretary of State John Kerry was a decorated veteran from the Vietnam War. He earned 2 Purple Hearts. And he returned from the war and became the central leading figure in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Artists, authors, pop culture figures as well became central to the anti-war movement. Of course, hippies and other variants of what we generalize as the hippie culture, socialist and even religious figures. There's 2 broad categorizations of like the folks who supported or did not support the war. In the 60s, a group known as the Doves would be a group that was really made up into 3 parts. One group, as a pacifist element, believes that any war is immoral. There's other groups who feel that, like moderate Democrats, that feel that the Vietnam War was illegal and unjust, that particular war. There were other groups that believed U.S. capitalist society was corrupt and fundamentally flawed, and that the inequality within the country and the destruction in Vietnam was somehow a result of U.S. capitalist society. And so individuals like this believed that the United States must be fundamentally reworked, and they were the more radical wing of the anti-war movement. On the other side, of course, you have the Hawks, and the Hawks were comprised of Republicans and conservative Democrats who really believed in the Vietnam War, and they believed in the domino theory, and they believed it should be fought, and oftentimes fought in a less regulated manner, and that it should be won. And in some cases, these individuals will come out, in some cases, to even protest the protesters, as we see with, for example, the hard hat movement. And we'll talk more about that in the next lesson. For many hawks, protest was basically the equivalent to treason. And so these are the kind of poles of society centered around the controversy of the Vietnam War. The beginnings of the anti-war movement came really in 1964 with a protest at University of California, Berkeley, against something that was really not about the war per se, but was rather about free speech on college campuses. The Berkeley free speech movement, led by groups like the Committee on Racial Equality, or CORE, organized a massive sit-in and stand-in on the campus, largely because they felt it was unfair that corporations that manufactured military weapons were able to hold job fairs on campus, but yet the ability of CORE to mobilize politically on campus was shut down by the university, and this led to the Berkeley free speech movement, where we see a highly publicized protest at the University of California, Berkeley in 1964, and which provided one of the first visible emergences of Joan Baez as one of those pop culture figures from the greater San Francisco area that would become a leading sort of component of the anti-war movement. In 1965, after the Americanization of the war, I remember the first 3,000 troops splashed ashore at Da Nang in March of 1965 as the bombing campaign Operation Rolling Thunder began. As 1965 developed, the anti-war movement did not emerge as huge, massive protests all over the country. Instead, it emerged in 1965 in what was called the teach-ins. And these were basically these were events that were held at major universities across the United States, and they would generally be held in the auditorium. And the first ones at Michigan University, and some 3,000 attended that event. And you would have students, faculty, and they would come and they would speak, and they would talk about the issue of Vietnam. And some supported, some opposed. It was an open forum. A great thing, actually, really, when you think about what should be happening on college campuses, is talking about hard issues and trying to help find a solution through a dialogue between teachers and students and other officials. Members of the State Department were actually invited there. This is Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, first for Kennedy and then, of course, for Johnson. The State Department they wanted them to participate, and for a brief period they attempted to participate, but in general they came off very dismissive and arrogant, and they treated the students as though, and Dean Rusk himself never actually went. I believe it was McGeorge Bundy who attended at the teach-in at Michigan, but I could be mistaken about that. But they generally came off dismissive. Oh, you don't really understand what's going on here. You can't understand the complexities of the Cold War and the struggle against communism and the domino theory. And so the involvement of the State Department was sort of counterproductive, because they weren't able to engage in a really meaningful way, and instead they came off somewhat antagonistic. The big issues for the anti-war movement in the 60s are the draft and the issue really of what we might call a form of chemical warfare. So in the 60s, the draft was very unfair. So if you were a college student, you could get a college deferment and you did not have to go into the draft. The draft was, the way it was set up in the 60s, really fundamentally favored more affluent individuals over poorer individuals. And the consequence of that is that the majority of the people disproportionately that were disproportionate to their numbers in society that were out there fighting and dying in the bush, as they would call, the jungle war in Vietnam, were oftentimes from poor sectors of society, and oftentimes disproportionately from African American segments of society, as African Americans made upwards of almost 30% of grunts fighting in the bush, ground troops who fought in the jungles of Vietnam, who saw combat, were called grunts, and they fought in the bush. And there's nearly 30% of them in those positions were African Americans, even though African Americans made up only 13% of the society. And that's a huge, huge issue, a huge controversy. The draft, being asked to go fight and die in a war in a far-off land that you might not agree with, and which, it's very difficult for an American to accept the idea that Ho Chi Minh was somehow tantamount to a fundamental national security threat to the United States that required, a war in a far-off region. And so during the anti-war protests, the number one way people would show their resistance would be by burning your draft cards, which was done in mass during the Vietnam War. The issue of the use of napalm, which often resulted in civilian killings when napalm attacks, hit near a village. There were often vivid and horrifying images of civilians killed or maimed by napalm, which is jellied gasoline. It sticks to whatever it comes to, and it burns until it burns out. The usage of Agent Orange, also the defoliant toxin that was sprayed over thousands of acres of South Vietnamese jungle that still cause issues with birth defects and cancer in the area today. And of course, big companies like Dow Chemical were profiting from this. And these were really at the core of much of the early anti-war movement. By 1966, we see a move away from the teach-ins had not really created a solution. And so you see a move away from teach-ins to larger gatherings and protest marches organized by groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, who in November 27, 1966, brought 30,000 people into D.C. to protest Johnson's increase in troop numbers, ultimately up to 400,000 by 1967. So not by 66, but by 67 is when we reach. I believe the number was 431,000. I could be mistaken on that, but you get the point here. The troop numbers are going up significantly. Casualties are going up significantly, and as that happens, and more Americans are drafted into this conflict, more and more the conflict is broadcast on people's nightly news. We see the protest movement become larger. We start to see major marches and demonstrations on college campuses. Across the country, in cities and on college campuses as well, but particularly in places like Washington, D.C., San Francisco, New York, and so forth. Of course, the biggest pre-Tet Offensive protest, the Tet Offensive occurs in January of 1968, January really till March 1968, this countrywide offensive in South Vietnam that really shocked the American people, led reporters like Walter Cronkite to call the conflict a stalemate. Before Tet, on the eve of Tet, the largest national protest gathering was the October 1967 Stop the Draft Week protest. We saw 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. We saw huge marches in San Francisco. The individual here burning the draft card, in the image to the right, is an individual burning their draft card in San Francisco. To the left, we see the protesters in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. 100,000 came out to Washington, D.C. In one case, an individual, Norman Mailer, who was a mentally unstable individual, he went to the Pentagon and actually burned himself, doused himself with gasoline, and a la the self-immolations of those Buddhist monks back in 1963 in South Vietnam, burned himself to death underneath the window of Robert McNamara. And this is something that really, really began to trouble Robert McNamara, who is going to almost simultaneously with this step down from his position as Secretary of Defense over an opposition with Johnson. Robert McNamara had come out and acknowledged that the bombing wasn't working, that we shouldn't continue to escalate, that we should halt the bombing and look for peace. And Johnson saw this as disloyal and would ultimately sort of push Robert McNamara out of his position as Secretary of Defense. McNamara went to head the IMF World Bank, but McNamara will become really one of the most prominent writers of his period of that period of time in the United States government policymaking circles, and he became an outspoken critic of the war after he leaves Johnson's administration, writing very famous books like Argument Without End, for example. Protesters chanted things like, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh is going to win, and hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? Johnson's handling of the war was down tremendously. It was down to 28%, and for the first time, less than 50% of the populace in the United States agreed with the war. As the protests escalate in 1965 and 1967, particularly in 1967, Johnson became irate over this. He was very angry over these protesters. He really couldn't understand why the protesters seemed to hate him so much. And in his view, the cause was the idea that he thought groups like the SDS were communists, that they were actually sort of insurgents that were intentionally directed to undermine the United States from within. And as a result, he will order the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, under the programs of COINTELPRO, to infiltrate groups like the SDS. They use illegal wiretaps, and they single out leading figures for harassment from like the IRS, doing audits on groups to cause problems, inserting molds into groups and try to undermine those groups. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., after he came out against the war in 1967, of course, becomes, in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover, he became enemy of the state number one. And they kept significant tabs on Martin Luther King Jr. The other thing that Johnson did was to basically tell the country that we were actually winning the war. So he had a problem with the fact that more and more Americans, and even though the amount of people in terms of protesting, there's never a vast majority of Americans that are out in the streets protesting. Maybe 25% of Americans at the height of the anti-war movement are visibly and vocally protesting. Maybe. It's never a majority of the people. But even that's the case, opinion polls showed that his policy was becoming increasingly unpopular and that his approval rating was becoming increasingly low. And so his response to this was basically to go on a public relations campaign. And he would go out with other policymakers in the fall of 1967 and basically tell everyone, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. Tell everyone, we're winning. General William Westmoreland's out there advocating, we're doing fine, we're winning, the war's almost over, these types of things. And that really exacerbated the shock of the Tet Offensive. When the Tet Offensive is launched at the end of January 1968, Americans basically say, I thought we were winning. And suddenly you see Viet Cong blasting into the compound of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. We see a gunfight between, a civilian representative in Saigon, one of our guys who's killing a Viet Cong, who's carrying an M16, right? That was obviously stolen from on the battlefield from American casualties. We saw Americans saw effectively a little battle in the Saigon embassy. There were battles all over Vietnam, particularly in Hue, which was the most probably devastating battle of the conflict, of the offensive, and also, of course, the battle at Khe Sanh, which becomes a focal point for the year 1968, which Khe Sanh was an American fire base located near the DMZ, near the border, infiltration points near the border of Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. The ramifications of going out there in 67 to try to defang the anti-war movement by telling everyone we're winning is that when the Tet Offensive occurs and catches the Americans and their South Vietnamese ally by surprise, it really shocked journalists, it really shocked the American people, which leads, for example, Walter Cronkite to say, clearly, this war is a stalemate. The 1960s counterculture, which was really launched as a branch of the anti-war movement and the broader cultural social revolution of the 60s, was really a challenge to the idea of normality. You see here in this picture, you see this is the Merry Pranksters, and they're all riding on top of the bus that they would call Further. And the idea, this multicolored painted bus, they would travel across the country on road trips, and they took up this idea that they were going to try to shock Americans. They were going to shock Americans into effectively rethinking the norms of American democratic society and citizenship. And that's why the Merry Pranksters, led by individuals like Ken Kesey, often garnered themselves in the red, white, and blue as a way of sort of a kind of way of engaging the concept of American citizenship and shocking Americans in their view, and trying to shock Americans into a new sort of way of thinking about their country. The counterculture was, it was centered on music, and it was a revolution in lifestyle, in notions of gender, in notions of social behavior and norms, and largely centered around music and rock and roll. Much of the early counterculture was centered around, of course, in San Francisco, the electric Kool-Aid acid tests, as they were called, which I'll talk more in just a second. Counterculture was about challenging norms of sexuality, challenging gender norms, and challenging behavioral norms. And so we see, within the counterculture, we see so-called love-ins, we see, festivals and music events where clothes are entirely optional. We find widespread drug use, often psychedelic in nature, hallucinogens like LSD, which they believed were a mind-opening drug that could create new ways of thinking about American society. There were also communal living groups who established communes, individuals that shirked the capitalist consumer culture of the country, particularly groups like the Diggers, who were particularly put off by the commodification of rock and roll music that ultimately occurs. This is an expression of individuality, of creative individuality, and often could appear quite hedonistic in nature. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, which are discussed in Kramer's book, The Republic of Rock, at some length, they were centered around this idea here, if you see the quote below, over the idea that, quote, says Kesey, "We will pursue the obliteration of the entire nation." Not taken literally, of course. "We won't blow up their buildings, we'll blow their minds," says Ken Kesey. So the Merry Pranksters would travel around the country, particularly with bands like the Grateful Dead. When the Grateful Dead were known as the Warlocks early on, the Grateful Dead were almost like the house band for the Merry Pranksters' electric Kool-Aid acid tests. Ken Kesey organized, and Tom Wolfe wrote about these electric Kool-Aid acid tests, where individuals would be asked to come to a venue of some kind, initially in Ken Kesey's house in California, and to take acid, to listen to the music, to be, overwhelmed in a sensory sense by the electronic sounds and the lights, and somehow to use this as a channel for breaking through the sort of norms of society and pursuing a reconstruction of American democratic society. You might think that this sounds strange, right? But this is very much how Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and many others of the counterculture movement understood what they were doing. They formed communes in many cases, some groups did, as a way of resisting the sort of consumerist capitalist culture of the United States. Counterculture had, I'll go ahead and put I'll just put all these up here for you. Counterculture really involved a lot of contradictions. In one respect, counterculture embraced capitalist consumer culture while simultaneously resisting it. The great icons of the counterculture rock and roll movement. You think about the Beatles in the late 60s when John Lennon had the big beard, his hair's all grown out, and he's publicizing his sort of love affair with Yoko Ono, and promoting the ideas of peace and free love. The Beatles were, of course, a commodified product, right? That made lots and lots of money. And this could be somewhat of a contradiction for some that were actually, in some ways, were actually framing what they were doing as resistance to the sort of consumer capitalist culture of the Americans, of the United States, of the Americans, of the United States. Likewise, the music industry was built on capitalism. Promoters like Bill Graham, the advent of FM radio, venues selling out shows, booking bands, paying bands, right? Technology and affluence, too, makes this all possible, right? Selling records, getting your records in a jukebox, right? It's multicultural to a point, but oftentimes the feelings reflect affluent American middle class. Counterculture is escapist often. In the 60s, there's controversy everywhere. There's the Watts riots in Southern California in 1965. There's, of course, the horrible events that are occurring in places like Mississippi and Alabama. There are the neo-Nazi protests or neo-Nazi demonstrations against civil rights individuals in places like Chicago. And so there's controversy, violence everywhere, war everywhere. In Vietnam, these images are everywhere. And so individuals in many cases in the counterculture sought to find freedom inside oneself and to try to escape from the sort of negativity of the world. And this factored into the emergence of the Eastern religion craze. Of course, the Beatles famously went to India. George Harrison became a Hare Krishna, and he was a devoted Hare Krishna until his death in the early 2000s. Timothy Leary, of course, promoted LSD as sort of a solution to this. The idea of tune in, turn on, and drop out was the sort of phrase that became so famous for the former professor, Timothy Leary, who advocated using LSD as a way to open new perceptions of reality and to reframe the world. A lot of counterculture, I think oftentimes counterculture is stereotyped as being all about the flower children and happiness and peace and love. And while you have aspects of that, the reality is that the counterculture movement is very oftentimes very apocalyptic and dark. And this is conveyed in songs like, Frank Zappa from his album Freak Out, the song Trouble Coming Every Day, which was a song that really, spoke aggressively about the violence and racial inequality in the United States. Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, the super dark Doors song, The End, also The Unknown Soldier by the Doors, which are very, very dark, even apocalyptic sounding songs that really shocked many people that weren't part of the counterculture. By 1966 and 67, the anti-war movement and counterculture becomes truly pop culture. You see pictured here Jimi Hendrix, a guitar player who only really was was in his prime as a, he was only really a thing for 3.5 years, but is generally regarded, he died, of course, in 1970, tragically, but he's generally regarded, even still to this day, as one of the greatest guitar players of all time, and was one of the most revolutionary figures of the 1960s counterculture. Joan Baez, famous for her folk renditions of songs like The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, and so forth. The Byrds, the Doors, the Youngbloods, famous for songs like Come On People Now, Country Joe and the Fish, who was, of course, a counterculture folk group who at Woodstock famously played his Vietnam song, and in which he had the entire audience of some almost 400,000 people chanting the F word. He had them spell it out. Give me an F. Give me a U. Give me a C. Give me a K. And he says, what's that spell? And everybody starts chanting it out. And today we think about that word, and that word to us is just a vulgar word that's almost, for many people, become just sort of a commonplace word to say. It's just like part of almost the language now, because we hear it so much in the films and so forth. But the usage of that word in the late 60s was an intentional and purposeful deployment of language of the sexual revolution. It was a aggressive and militant sexualized word that shocked people that heard it, who weren't associated with the counterculture. And that was what was going on there. They weren't just saying that word because, I don't know, they watched The Big Lebowski too many times and they can't get that word out of their head. If you haven't seen that movie, that word is used a lot in that movie. That's a modern movie, okay? It came out in the 90s. But it wasn't just this commonplace, it's just how people with vulgar tongues speak. The sexual revolution became, in many cases, something that used vulgar language as a weapon against the traditional norms of society. Civil rights leaders became involved in the counterculture. Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, particularly in California. There were great minds like the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who became a proponent against the war. The conscientious objector movement becomes a huge phenomenon by the late 60s. 30,000 individuals moved to Canada. The Fort Hood Three were imprisoned for refusing to deploy. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War forms in the spring of 1967. And, of course, their foremost leader, as I mentioned earlier, will, of course, be the future Secretary of State and former presidential candidate John Kerry, the two-time Purple Heart figure from the Vietnam War, who will lead things like the Winter Soldier March in the early 1970s. All right, I'm going to have, for class, I'm going to have an associated video that will let you listen to and hear some of the music of the counterculture and see how these individuals like Jimi Hendrix, for example, or the Doors or the Grateful Dead, what the counterculture looks like, what their message sounds like, how it comes through in their music, and so forth. So I hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week.